Yeah, media ethics, they're important because if they're followed, they give more credibility to a publication. A publication is going to be more believable and seen as more reliable if it's seen as following, a pretty strict ethical code. It also leads to the stories being more accurate, and that also adds to the credibility and reliability. Some of the basic ethical guidelines would be, well, I think I'll break it down into two parts, like strict ethical guidelines, and then standards of objectivity, and they kind of tie together. Ethical guidelines would be, obviously like not taking payments from sources, not accepting gifts or favors from sources, people you cover. Um, um, what would be avoiding conflicts of interest, not being seen as supporting either side in debates. Like you wouldn't like a good ethical code would prohibit its reporters from participating in marches or rallies or protests. Yeah, you wouldn't be allowed to, march in a right to life parade or march in, protest at an anti-abortion rally or pro-abortion rally, things like that. If you'd be seen as committing yourself to one side, and if you covered that topic, then you wouldn't be seen as objective. Um, there, reporters and editors have never been prohibited from voting in elections, as far as I know. But a longtime well-known editor at the Washington Post, Len Downey, he was famous for never voting in elections. He refused to vote. He said that even the act of voting means that I'd have to think about who to vote for, and that would introduce a subtle bias. I voted for this guy, so I want him to do better, and maybe we'll give him better coverage. So he never voted. He never made a conscious decision of which candidate was better or worse. Um, with other standards of objectivity, objectivity is, it's impossible for anyone to be totally objective. Um, People are normal; they have their biases, but there are rules that newsrooms can enforce to try to get the publication as objective as possible. Always get both sides of the story. Get if you're getting something controversial or debatable from somebody, get it from a second source. Have two sources to back up things. Um, Newspapers and magazines often rely on unnamed sources, anonymous sources. And that can be tricky because anonymous sources, if they know they're not going to be named, they might have a tendency to tell you, anything you want to hear, or exaggerate, the truth, or hype things because they know their name's not going to be attached. So these sources, a good ethical code would mandate that these sources be disclosed to an editor, a high up editor, and you would discuss this source with that editor and what the person's agenda might be and who it is and where they're coming from before you would decide to go with that source. Um, what else? I made some notes, and I think.
I do have a quick question of your last point. Do you have any thoughts on anonymous sources?
Um, yeah, anonymous sources. You can get some very good stories from anonymous sources, and there's just a lot of stories that are really hard to get without relying on anonymous sources. And so I don't rule them out completely. Now, when I worked in Tampa, our major competitor was the St. Petersburg Times, and they did have a rule. They never printed anonymous sources. So we were able to beat them on some things where an anonymous source would tip us off, and if we could confirm it, we would go with it. But they should be kept to a minimum. You should really, a reporter should really try hard to get an anonymous source to go on the record, or to find people who will say the same thing on the record. You don't want to have a story just full of anonymous sources, and you don't really know whether to believe it or not. Anonymous sources definitely hurt the credibility of papers. So you're making a judgment. Is the loss of credibility, maybe a slight loss of credibility, worth like breaking this really big story? And that always has to be weighed. Um, an example of where anonymous sources just got completely out of control was during the Trump years in the White House. And the Washington Post and the New York Times were being fed lots of stories from anonymous sources about whether Trump had colluded with the Russians to win an election. And these were all people with an agenda. These were FBI officials, CIA officials, State Department officials, and they often had an agenda. They didn't like Trump. They wanted him out of office. Um, and so they would feed reporters alleged scoops that, weren't really checked out. The sources weren't shared with editors. There was sort of a frenzy to prove this Russian collusion theory. And all of those stories have been debunked. The whole Russian collusion thing has been debunked. Papers printed thousands of stories that ended up not being true. The Washington Post and New York Times won Pulitzers for the Russian collusion stories. All of those stories ended up being not true. So anonymous sources can get you into big trouble. You have to be very careful. Often the anonymous sources would call up a reporter late in the evening, like maybe 8, 9 o'clock, not that long before deadline, and tell the reporter something really juicy, something really hot, and knowing that there wouldn't be time to double check it, there wouldn't be time for it to go through all the normal channels, and it would appear in the paper the next day. And so the sources were definitely manipulating the press to push an agenda, and that was definitely a low point for journalism. In terms of other ethical guidelines and objectivity guidelines. A big one is not letting anonymous sources criticize something or someone anonymously. They're called blind attacks. Like you quote somebody saying, "Oh, the mayor is on the take," or "the mayor is totally corrupt," or "the mayor is whatever," and the source's name is not given, and you can't really go to the mayor and say, well, this anonymous person says blah blah blah. Um, so you really want to avoid. You never want to use anonymous sources just making attacks on people, or institutions, or companies or whatever. But these days you see attacks like that all the time. You see anonymous sources attacking somebody. It leaves the target of the attack kind of defenseless. He doesn't really know who's attacking him. He doesn't really know what to say. It's just really unfair. Uh, you always want to give people a chance to respond to criticism. Um, you don't want to editorialize in stories. Give your opinions in stories. You want stories to stick to the facts and not go beyond where the facts are. And there's kind of a fine line between analysis and editorializing, but editors need to be on the watch for that. And it's the editorializing that gets papers into trouble and loses them credibility. Readers might agree with your facts, but then when you start interpreting the facts, they might not agree with that, and you might be out on a limb. Um, One little like style point of mine that I always tried to enforce was stories should really limit using adjectives and adverbs. This sounds like a small point, but um, it's the adverbs and the adjectives that get reporters and papers into trouble. Um, Trying to describe something, or trying to um, make a judgment on how serious something was or not serious it was, or so that's sort of a writing tip I would give to anybody. Like, watch the adjectives and adverbs. Usually they're unnecessary. Usually they just make stories longer. They just add extra verbiage. You know. So anyway, that's like a writing tip that I would pass along. Um, Let me see what else. When on the whole ethics thing, well, this is more of a conflict of interest thing. When I started on the Daily Journal, one of my first jobs was as a political reporter, and I wrote a weekly political column, and I covered politics. And an editor told me that I should, if I'm going to vote, I should register to vote as an independent, not as a Democrat or a Republican, because voter registration records are public. And people, if they sense any bias in my stories, they would look up my voting record, and then they would say, "Aha, you're a Democrat," or "Aha, you're a Republican," and so I know where you're coming from. So I always took that tip to heart, and I've always been registered as an independent. Um, and Anyway, those are some of the ethical and objectivity standards. In terms of, you asked about social media. Um, Social media is a big problem for newspapers and magazines. Their reporters, publications have, since the beginning of social media, publications have tried to rein in the reporters and prevent them from, uh, tweeting or going on Facebook. It's a losing battle. Um, Papers are ambivalent about it. On one hand, since social media started, we've always been told to post any story that we edit or write on social media, so it gets bigger play, so it gets more clicks. Social media became the main way to circulate, to circulate news. Social media, Facebook became the new circulation department, the new, paper boy of the digital age. So, I've, for I guess the last 15 years or so, I've posted any story that I've worked on. I've posted it on Facebook and on Twitter and on LinkedIn. Those are the main three that I deal with. Um, but a lot of reporters go beyond that, and they start giving their opinions on Twitter, and they get into debates on Twitter, and they're completely revealing like what they really think and where their biases are, and just the act of being in debate reinforces their biases. Um, and so papers have periodically tried to clamp down on that. I was at Forbes, and when I was at Forbes, one of the reporters, this is probably about 10 years ago, one of the reporters got into trouble tweeting something that was controversial. The editor was super mad, called everyone in, chewed everybody out. We have to stop posting. We have to stop, putting our opinions on Twitter, blah, blah, blah. But it didn't really last that long. And it's hard to enforce a rule like that. You post your story, readers start debating it, you want to answer. Um, it's big trouble. It's big trouble. It really hurts the credibility of papers. And that kind of ties in with a problem that papers and magazines have in general. It's hard. Almost all of these ethical and rules of objectivity that I've talked about have all broken down in the digital age. Reporters go off and march in rallies, and they take paid speeches. They travel to paid speeches. They go on TV and they participate in panels in which they're giving their opinions. Almost all of this is broken down, and none of this would have been allowed in the 80s and early 90s. And now reporters do it routinely, and um, and and publications have a really hard time reining this in. Um, The trouble is, and it's trouble only for the publications. It's great for the staffers. Staffers can carve out their own identity. You can be a star reporter at the New York Times, and you can tweet things out, and you can have this huge following on Twitter. You can gather up hundreds of thousands of followers, and that might get you on TV, and then you might get paid as a contributor on TV, and then you get paid speeches, and you can carve out a whole identity. And it's really hard for a publication to control people like that. You can't enforce ethical standards on people who have become bigger than the paper. And so it just breaks down for everybody. Um, and a lot of journalists end up quitting, and they start their own Substack, and they go on YouTube and have a channel on YouTube, and you can carve out your own individual identity beyond your papers. Before you were as famous as your byline, and now you can go way beyond that. There's all sorts of venues for that. When Twitter started, the thing that was interesting about Twitter was that you didn't have to register under your publication's name or anything. It wasn't a function of your publication. You registered under your own name. So, my Twitter handle is at John Koppisch, and I could switch papers, I can switch magazines. I'll always have the same followers. I'll always have, my same identity. It's in the olden days, once you quit a paper, that was it, and you had to like restart everything from scratch at a new publication. So that all of that has led to the breakdown of the old standards, and just the fact that papers and magazines are just not as economically vibrant as they used to be, adds to the weakness of the lowering standards and objectivity. I was when I started on the when I was on the Tampa Tribune in the late '80s. We had 400 people in the newsroom. We were one of the biggest newsrooms in the country. We covered everything in Florida. We had all kinds of beats. Money was really no object. They sent me to Europe twice on reporting, junkets in effect. I put in massive expense accounts. No one blinked an eye. Um, that was the heyday. And, then when the internet started, all of that ended. The peak year for advertising was 2000. And then it's been downhill ever since. And lots of papers have closed, lots of magazines have closed. I've worked at 7, 8, 9 different publications. Half of them are closed today. The Tampa Tribune closed in 2016. It went from 400 reporters and editors in the late 80s, early 90s to nothing in 2016. You can't even find where the building was. We had this massive building on the waterfront in Tampa. It's hard to find where that even was. But all the competition from the internet, before the internet, a town might have one or two papers. So advertisers had to go to you to advertise. With the internet, there's millions and millions of websites. There's tons of competition. So advertising rates came down. And we always talked about how print dollars, with the internet age, print dollars became digital dimes. You could charge basically 10% for a digital ad of what you could charge for a print ad. And then when mobile phones came in and mobile phone advertising started to take off in the early 2010s, the digital dimes became cell phone pennies. And so you were getting 1% of the ads, the ad revenue that you used to get. When I started at Forbes, we could charge $1 million for a back page full color ad. And, obviously you can't charge anything close to that today. So staffs are much smaller than they used to be. There's many fewer editors, many fewer reporters. And so the standards are just naturally going to drop. You just don't have the resources that you used to have. And the internet also forces you to write and post much faster. So that also reduces the standards. If you get a news, if news breaks and you're on the story, you have to post it right away, whether it's 10 o'clock in the morning or 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Back in the day, you had all day to research that story and interview more sources and hone and craft your story, and then you turn it in maybe 5 or 6 o'clock, and your editor would go through it and catch some mistakes, and then the next day would be in the paper. So it's obviously a much better story than what you're batting out very quickly at 2 in the afternoon. And there's just many fewer reporters and many fewer editors. So all of that has lowered, the quality of journalism over the last 20 years or so.